In Goodfellas, we see Paulie Cicero moving slowly through the cab stand in East New York, collecting tributes from his crew while Henry Hill watches in awe. Paul Sorvino plays him with a quiet, measured authority, speaking softly, never raising his voice, moving deliberately because, as Henry explains in voiceover, Paulie did not have to move for anybody. When he tells Henry never to use the telephone and later forbids drug dealing, audiences interpret these rules as evidence of old-school honor. The film's most memorable scenes show Paulie slicing garlic with a razor blade in prison, hosting backyard barbecues, and gently chastising Henry for betraying his trust. This portrayal creates a lasting impression that mafia stability came from restrained, principled leaders who drew clear moral lines. But the real Paul Vario, photographed in his 1980 mugshot after his extortion conviction, was described by federal prosecutors as one of the most violent and dangerous career criminals in the city of New York. Court records and contemporary news reports document a man with a hair-trigger temper who once beat a restaurant maitre d' for spilling wine on his wife, then sent associates with baseball bats and pipes to assault the entire staff later that night. His criminal resume, detailed in his 1988 obituary in the New York Times, included rape, burglary, loan sharking, hijacking, and racketeering, crimes spanning 5 decades in and out of prison. The calm patriarch shown in Goodfellas bears almost no resemblance to the volatile capo who sanctioned murders, profited from cocaine shipments, and betrayed the protégé he claimed to mentor. What Martin Scorsese and Nicholas Pileggi created was not simply inaccurate. They constructed a composite character who merged Paul Vario's crew management role with the corporate facades of Gambino family bosses Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano, men who projected business-like restraint while ordering executions and corrupting labor unions. This is the real story behind Paulie Cicero, not a wise elder, but a structural buffer designed to absorb risk and maintain distance between street-level violence and the men who profited from it. Paul Vario rose through the Lucchese crime family during the 1940s and the 1950s by running gambling operations, loan sharking rackets, and cargo hijacking at JFK Airport. Born in Brooklyn in 1914, he became a capo who controlled his own crew of soldiers and associates. FBI surveillance reports describe Vario as the primary authority over illegal operations at the airport cargo terminals, extorting air freight companies, and fencing stolen goods through a network of warehouses. Henry Hill, who began running errands for Vario when he was 11, later told investigators that Vario demanded a cut from every racket his crew touched: hijackings, bookmaking, union kickbacks, and eventually point-shaving schemes at Boston College. The Paul Vario documented in court records was not patient or restrained. After a wine-spilling incident at a Manhattan restaurant in the 1960s, witnesses reported that Vario sent men with pipes and baseball bats who hospitalized staff members. During a 1972 dispute over gambling debts, Vario personally assaulted a debtor in a Brooklyn social club, breaking the man's jaw and ribs. His temper was so well known within organized crime that associates learned to avoid direct confrontation, not out of respect for his wisdom, but out of fear of his volatile nature. But in Goodfellas, Paulie Cicero speaks in near whispers and moves with deliberate calm. Paul Sorvino later admitted in interviews that he struggled to find the character's menace, spending days before filming searching for a deadly, soulless quality that would coexist with paternal warmth. The performance that emerged suggests a man who dislikes violence and prefers negotiation, a portrayal that contradicts every documented account of Paul Vario's actual behavior. Hollywood made this choice because the narrative required a stable authority figure. Martin Scorsese said he wanted to seduce everybody into the movie and into the style, and then just take them apart with it. For that seduction to work, audiences needed to believe Henry Hill entered a world with rules and structure. Paulie Cicero functions as that anchor, the father figure whose approval validates Henry's choices and whose rejection signals Henry's moral collapse. If the film had shown Vario's actual temperament, the sudden rages, the personal violence, and the exploitation of his own crew, the seduction would have failed in the first act. Vario built his operation through strategic alliances and calculated brutality. During the 1950s, he cultivated relationships with Teamsters officials and airport cargo handlers, using intimidation and bribery to secure control over loading docks at JFK. His crew would identify high-value shipments and either hijack trucks en route or steal cargo directly from terminals using inside information. The stolen goods moved through a distribution network that stretched from Brooklyn warehouses to fences in Manhattan's Diamond District. Henry Hill's entry into this world came through geographical proximity. Growing up across the street from Vario's cab stand in East New York, Hill observed the daily flow of tribute and transaction. By the age of 11, he was skipping school to run errands. Vario cultivated young prospects by offering protection from neighborhood bullies and cash that seemed enormous to children from working-class families. Hill later testified that Vario presented himself as a mentor, teaching patience and discipline while gradually involving him in more serious crimes. The real relationship was more exploitative than the film suggests. Vario used young associates as insulation, placing them in legal jeopardy while he maintained distance from street-level operations. When Hill was arrested at the age of 16 for using a stolen credit card, Vario paid for a lawyer, but made clear that Hill was expected to remain silent about who ordered the theft. This pattern continued throughout their association. Vario approved criminal schemes, collected the largest share of profits, and ensured that younger crew members absorbed the risk of arrest. Hollywood simplified this dynamic because the film needed audiences to sympathize with Henry's choices. If Vario appeared predatory from the beginning, Henry would seem foolish rather than seduced. On December 11, 1978, 6 armed men entered the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport and stole approximately $6 million in cash and jewelry, the largest cash robbery in American history at that time. James Burke, known as Jimmy Conway in the film, answered directly to Vario. Multiple sources note that Burke needed Vario's approval before proceeding. The reason for urgency was financial. Vario and Burke had recently lost a major cocaine shipment and needed cash to cover the debt to their suppliers. Vario gave explicit permission for the Lufthansa heist, understanding that a successful heist would generate substantial income through his share of the proceeds. The immediate aftermath created a problem. Members of Burke's crew began spending money ostentatiously, attracting FBI attention. Within weeks, Burke, with Vario's approval according to federal testimony, began systematically murdering crew members to eliminate witnesses. The first killing was Parnell Stacks Edwards, who had failed to dispose of the getaway van as instructed. When police discovered the van with fingerprints intact, Burke and Vario decided Edwards had become a liability. Burke shot Edwards 6 times on December 18, 1978, exactly 1 week after the heist. Court documents detail how Vario participated in the decision to authorize additional murders. Over the next year, at least 10 people connected to the heist were killed. FBI reports indicate that Vario and Burke met regularly to discuss which crew members posed risks and should be eliminated. When questioned years later, Henry Hill testified that Vario showed no remorse about the murders, viewing them as necessary business decisions. But in Goodfellas, Paulie appears after the heist, quietly telling Jimmy to warn everyone against spending money. The scene positions Paulie as the responsible adult attempting to control reckless children. There is no mention of his approval for the heist, no acknowledgement that he needed the money from a lost cocaine shipment, and no suggestion that he sanctioned the subsequent murders. The movie protects Paulie's image by transforming him from an active participant into a cautious observer, collapsing the moral architecture that made the violence appear aberrational rather than structural. The most significant omission in Goodfellas involves Paul Vario's relationship with Henry Hill's family. Multiple accounts describe how Vario had an affair with Karen Hill, Henry's wife, during periods when Henry was in prison or heavily involved in drug dealing. The affair represented a profound betrayal of the paternal relationship the film depicts. Vario exploited the vulnerability of his protégé's family while maintaining the appearance of loyal mentorship. Vario's pattern of exploitation extended beyond individual betrayals. His criminal career included a 1937 rape conviction for which he served time in Sing Sing prison. In that case, Vario and another man were identified by a 16-year-old girl from Howard Beach who testified they had sexually assaulted her. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 to 20 years in Sing Sing, though he was paroled twice and returned to prison both times for violations. The conviction appears nowhere in Goodfellas, despite being a matter of public record documented in his New York Times obituary. The character's composite nature further complicates the historical record. Paulie Cicero incorporates characteristics from Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano, two Gambino crime family bosses who cultivated business like public personas. Gambino famously told state police investigators he worked as a labor relations consultant, deflecting questions about his actual role as one of the most powerful organized crime figures in America. Castellano described himself in testimony before the 1986 President's Commission on Organized Crime as a businessman whose job was to run the unions. Yet, commission records document that Castellano personally ordered multiple murders. His restraint was strategic theater designed to avoid prosecution, not genuine aversion to violence. Nicholas Pileggi later noted in interviews that real mobsters praised the film's authenticity, saying it felt like a home movie. But that authenticity applied to surface details, the social rituals, the insider language, the casual intimidation, not to the deeper structural reality. The real bosses who inspired Paulie did not avoid violence because they found it distasteful. They avoided direct involvement because it created legal exposure. Their calm was a tactic, not a philosophy. The film's most deliberate distortion involves the anti-drug rule that defines Paulie's moral position. In a pivotal scene, Henry approaches Paulie for financial help after being arrested for drug trafficking. Paulie gives Henry $3,200 and tells him, "Now, I've got to turn my back on you." The scene positions drug dealing as a moral betrayal that violates the organization's core principles. The historical record contradicts this entirely. FBI documents from the late 1970s detail how Paul Vario and James Burke lost a major cocaine shipment, creating the financial pressure that led directly to the Lufthansa heist. Vario was not opposed to drug trafficking on principle. He participated in it and profited from it. The real no drugs rule within mafia families was institutional policy designed to avoid federal prosecution. Bosses like Vario understood that drug convictions carried mandatory minimum sentences that could turn cooperating witnesses, so they officially forbade involvement while quietly taking percentages from crew members who dealt anyway. The rule was risk management, not ethics. Henry Hill testified to federal investigators that Vario knew about his drug dealing for years before his arrest, and never objected as long as Hill paid his tribute. The supposed prohibition only became relevant when Hill's arrest threatened to expose Vario's operations. At that point, Vario's decision to cut Hill off was strategic, distancing himself from a compromised associate to avoid being implicated in drug charges. Paul Vario's downfall came from the methodical work of federal prosecutors pursuing racketeering charges. In 1984, he was convicted of extorting the Air France cargo terminal at JFK Airport. Assistant United States Attorney Dennis Boehm denounced Vario as one of the most violent criminals in the city of New York during the sentencing hearing in 1986. Vario received 10 years in federal prison and was transferred to Fort Worth Federal Medical Center due to declining health. During his imprisonment, the scope of his criminal enterprise became clear through Henry Hill's cooperation with federal authorities. Hill, facing life imprisonment on drug charges, entered the Witness Protection Program in 1980 and provided detailed testimony about the Lucchese family's operations. Hill's testimony revealed the full extent of Vario's involvement in the Lufthansa heist, the subsequent murders, the Boston College point shaving scandal, and decades of systematic corruption at JFK Airport. Vario maintained silence throughout his prosecution, adhering to the mafia code that forbade cooperation with authorities. The record comes from surveillance transcripts, wiretaps, and the accounts of witnesses like Hill, sources that reveal a man primarily concerned with managing risk and maintaining income rather than upholding principles. Even in prison, Vario continued to issue orders to associates on the outside until his death from respiratory failure on May 3, 1988. Audiences who watch Goodfellas today remember Paulie Cicero as the moral center of the film, the one figure who represented something approaching wisdom in a world of chaos. Online discussions describe him as the only one with any sense, the real boss who understood how things should work, and the father figure Henry should have listened to. This interpretation shapes public understanding of organized crime in lasting ways, reinforcing the belief that mafia families once operated according to codes that prevented excess. This misconception serves multiple functions in American culture. It allows audiences to romanticize organized crime as a system that once possessed honor, distinguishing good gangsters who followed rules from bad gangsters who did not. It obscures the reality that violence was never an aberration, but the system's foundation, that bosses like Vario required men like Tommy DeSimone precisely because they were willing to kill, and that calm was a management strategy rather than a moral position. The film's enduring popularity has created what scholars call Godfather syndrome, the tendency of jury members, journalists, and the general public to view mafia defendants through the lens of fictional portrayals rather than documented facts. During the 1990s and the 2000s, federal prosecutors noted that defense attorneys would invoke Goodfellas and The Godfather in arguments, suggesting their clients were simply businessmen who followed codes, much like Paulie Cicero. The films became inadvertent character references for real criminals, providing cultural cover that complicated prosecutions. The cost of Hollywood's version is measured in erased victims and protected legacies. The 16-year-old girl Paul Vario raped in 1937 appears nowhere in public consciousness because the film omits that conviction. The workers he extorted, the families of murder victims like Stax Edwards, and the communities damaged by loan sharking and gambling operations become invisible when the narrative focuses on whether mobsters were good or bad, rather than acknowledging that the system itself was predatory. By transforming Vario into a wise patriarch, Goodfellas performs the same insulation function that Vario performed in life. It absorbs the brutality, keeps the violence at a distance, and allows audiences to believe in something that never existed. Martin Scorsese's stated intention was to seduce audiences before revealing moral emptiness, but the seduction proved so effective that many viewers never arrived at the revelation. They remember the exhilaration of the Copacabana tracking shot, the humor of the funny house scene, and the calm authority of Paulie slicing garlic in prison. 35 years after release, Goodfellas functions less as a cautionary tale and more as an aspirational fantasy, with Paulie Cicero serving as the wise elder audience wish had existed, proof that if only the right people had been in charge, the violence might have meant something. The seduction worked. The truth is simpler and more disturbing. Paul Vario was not wise. He was a buffer. His calm did not prevent violence. It managed exposure. His rules did not create order. They distributed risk. And the system did not fail because Henry Hill sold drugs. It functioned exactly as designed, with men like Vario insulated from consequences, while younger associates absorbed the danger. Hollywood needed audiences to misunderstand that structure in order to tell a compelling story. The question is whether we are still willing to believe it.